Hello, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Disaster Recovery, IT Resilience, and Continuity. What's the difference? I'm Kevin Collins from Unitrends, and I'm here with Joe Noonan, Vice President of Product Marketing. He'll be taking us through the presentation today. And don't forget, one lucky attendee will be walking away with a $100 Amazon gift card. We'll contact the winner via email after the webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. This session will be recorded, and after the event, you'll receive an email with a link to the on-demand version of the webinar. I would also encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. You can do so by typing them into the Q&A box in the bottom right of the player. We'll answer your questions at the end of the session. At this point, I'll turn it over to Joe. Enjoy the presentation, and Joe, take it away.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it. Appreciate everyone from joining as well. Hopefully, I won't take too much of your time today. And if we're lucky, I'll have helped you learn some interesting things for your organization's backup and continuity needs. Now, you saw the title. We're talking about disaster recovery, IT resilience, continuity. It's all just backup, right, in a lot of people's minds. Why kind of waste your time with even more new terms to describe it? Because I think probably what honestly goes through a lot of people's minds when they see webinars like this. What honestly we're really going to talk about in depth is IT resilience, right? There's something new about that we want folks to really gain some value from. But we do want to help you wade through kind of all the vendor marketing that's out there, including our own, honestly, when it comes to the different terms you might see thrown around when it comes to this space and what people are trying to do for organizations. And hopefully we'll help you understand how it applies to your organization, especially IT resilience, and what criteria you can use to evaluate ways to achieve it for yourselves. Now, it's kind of interesting. Why do you keep seeing these terms change over and over? You know, it started out kind of as backup and recovery, disaster recovery, continuity, all those things. And one reason, honestly, is because vendors like to market. And, you know, the reality is that's not always a bad thing. As new problems evolve, solutions evolve, vendors evolve, it's not that bad that marketing evolves too, right? The real key is just that you understand it and you can get value from it. And that's what I'm hoping to provide you with today as we get into that topic of IT resilience especially. So with the last slide, it talked about paradigm shifts, right? And really we're talking about kind of how this space shifts and how the solutions and problems are shifting. And, you know, you've all heard this one before. It's an oldie but goodie. But you obviously have backup and how that's kind of shifted from a lot of folks and vendors out there talking about disaster recovery. And really the idea of disaster recovery and backup has gotten pretty gray, especially because of all the vendor marketing out there, right? But people tend to get disaster recovery and the differences, especially with backup, right? Disaster recovery has three kind of main ways you can go about it. And the key trade-off is almost always downtime for cost, right? You have cold disaster recovery, which is typically a scenario where you're going to wait for an outage to occur, and then you're basically going to stand up systems and recover them somewhere. You might wait for your main site to come back online because you don't need a secondary site or you can't afford one. You may have a co-location or another site set aside, and at that point when something happens, you'll basically bring infrastructure in there and do your recoveries and get back up and running. So that tends to be the lowest cost option out there from the DR perspective, but there's obviously a lot of downtime associated with that. And then you have hot disaster recovery strategies, and these are almost no downtime. You're really talking about duplicate infrastructure in different locations, continuous replication, and obviously just very, very high cost because of that, but you get nearly no downtime as a result. A lot of people can't afford that. And honestly, these days, a lot of people can't afford cold anymore either because the high downtime concern is just too much for businesses to really, you know, maintain their edge in the marketplace. And that's why you're seeing a lot of warm strategies. Cloud is a big part of this. And this is where you're getting very little downtime. And costs just continue to decrease here. They're certainly higher than cold in most cases. But when you think about the overall cost to the business, and if you are thinking about strategy here, that is the right way to think. Cold can be, given the downtime factor, can be a lot more costly to your business than the warm strategies that are out there. So we think about the other shift here, right? We used the term continuity before. And we think about disaster recovery and continuity. Was there really a shift here, or is this really just kind of marketing BS? Or is there something legitimate to learn? Now, I think there's a lot of marketing BS around this. Unitrends uses it. Business continuity truly is a thing out there. Obviously, that's about business process, right? Disaster recovery is really about the IT infrastructure. And business continuity is beyond that, right? You're talking about how your entire organization is going to handle people, process, and infrastructure to maintain continuity of the company as it through some type of disaster. And then there's Unitrends out there saying all-in-one backup and continuity in our taglines, right? We're using continuity. It is a marketing term. Why do we use it? Honestly, because like I talked about before, as problems evolve, solutions evolve, and ultimately you want to basically use terms that are going to help kind of evolve that solution as well. Continuity is a solution that Unitrends has kind of evolved to, and we think that as we've added more disaster recovery services, especially with our DRaaS offering from the Unitrends Cloud, it has brought more continuity into the picture of what we're delivering, right? So it's definitely marketing. I don't want to lie about that. But at the same time, we're using the term because we believe we've kind of gone beyond what you typically see from a disaster recovery product or technology into more service-based offering. Now, I think the most important topic here today is something new, right? IT resilience. And when we think about why there is this other term out there, first I'll point out that this is not a Unitrends inspired term. This is something that I actually don't know the original origin, but I know Gartner was probably the first ones to really write about it. Back in December, they came out with the IT Resilience Orchestration Automation Market Guide. And this guide, it's not a magic quadrant. They're not ranking people, but ultimately they're talking about this concept of IT resilience. They discuss it, they define it. They talk about vendors in this space that are making inroads and kind of defining the space. So when we think about what it actually means and how Gartner really described it, they talked about improved IT serviceability, recovery, and integrity. All right, so obviously this includes and incorporates infrastructure and technologies related to backup and disaster recovery. But naturally, there's an extension here that we're trying to get to with IT resilience that shows more value. Another component is application focus, right? And this could be virtual, physical, or even cloud workloads. But it's not just infrastructure at the system level, it's application level focused. And you can kind of get from the term, right? We're talking about resilience. How do you kind of maintain that uptime in more unique, valuable ways than what you get from traditional disaster recovery? Now, when we think about why we're talking about this and why it's important to kind of have this new category of I'll call disaster recovery or data protection, this extension. So obviously there's tons and tons of change going on in the environment, right? We throw a couple stats out here with 33x. That's really how much faster the infrastructure is outpacing the IT admins that manage it. But you could also look at things like virtualization and other technologies, hyper-converged technologies within the platform, software-defined data centers, cloud, and how those workloads are becoming more mobile. There's just tons and tons of changing things that are adding complexity to IT, and ultimately a lot of that complexity and keeping up with that leads to downtime. And that's why you're seeing $700 billion in downtime costs in North America alone last year. Now, we think, again, we're talking about why IT resilience is a term we care about here. Failure to assure recovery leads to more downtime as well, not just complexity. Right? It's not just enough to have a data protection strategy. You need to make sure that ultimately it's going to work. GitLab is a great example, right? GitLab was doing backups for a very long time. A lot of you probably read about this story. There's plenty of articles out there. I hate to pick on them because they did a great job. They were awesome in handling the situation, given that they were in this situation. But what you could tell is they did put themselves in a situation where IT resilience wasn't something that they were thinking about proactively and was not implemented. Because ultimately they were down for a long time because someone deleted the wrong folder and their backups were bad. And this example is actually kind of a peeve of mine, having been in the backup space for so long, especially in the VM backup space for a while. I love great virtualization features. VMware has one called change block tracking. Microsoft implemented it recently in their Hyper-V 2016. And ultimately what it does is it's an API for backup of vendors and disaster recovery vendors to get access to data and perform incremental backups really fast. That's ultimately what it does. A lot of you probably know about it. And we know that when there's issues in those APIs, backup vendors can get hit, which means customers can suffer if they need to recover because backups can be bad and nobody knows about it. But the reality is there are ways to mitigate the impact, right? We all know about being able to test backups. We know it's painful to do manually. We'll talk about some things in this webinar that are going to help with this in a big way. But there are definitely ways to mitigate the impact. You can't just say, because there are bugs in a very, very important feature that can cause backups to go bad, that you don't have solutions out there really looking to help you out as organizations relying on us as backup and continuity and disaster recovery and IT resilience vendors. Now, ransomware is another one, right? New threats are prevailing out there and causing more issues for folks. And ransomware is a really interesting one. It's been around for a while, but the momentum around it really hasn't stopped. It feels like it's picking up. It's here to stay for sure for at least a while. It's a $1 billion market. It's expected to continue to grow. Gartner and others have said they believe it'll double for the next several years in terms of that industry and what's going on there. I'm not going to dive into ransomware itself very much here. I will talk a lot about ransomware as an IT resilience instigator, but we do have a great ebook out there if you want to get more acquainted with some of the various types of ransomware, the newer ones that are out there, some stats around it, and some good stories around how to kind of address it. It's called The Beginner's Guide to Ransomware. We have a link in there, the URL. But ultimately, this is ultimately something that's becoming a board-level conversation. What's interesting is that it's actually causing CIOs and even chief security officers to think a lot more about backup strategies. And where we're going to talk here about IT resilience, ransomware is a big factor. So how do we achieve it? Right, we know why it's important. We kind of define what, although it feels kind of vague. It talks about kind of an extension to backup and disaster recovery, increased serviceability, things like that. What does that really mean? How do you achieve it? And that's what we'll talk about for the rest of the webinar here. So the first big component to it is advanced testing and reporting automation. Right, so it's not just enough to protect, it's not just enough to recover fast. Now we're talking about advanced level features that involve automation, orchestration, and ultimately these are ensuring that your strategies in place for backup and disaster recovery are sound and working, and they're working. Right, we kind of have this old world, new world view of things where you talk about the old days of praying that backups recovered successfully, which they didn't always because of things like VMware CVT issues. Scrambling during your DR exercises. If you have multiple sites, you're running through those exercises, you're actually taking the time to test, and darn it, the tests fail. You don't really get to do them very often because they are very time consuming, and to create your auditing reports and all that is just a complete nightmare. And that's where the automation and kind of the new world really helps to achieve that. And we're not talking about just local sites. We're not just talking about DR sites. We're also talking about cloud as well. So we'll dig into a little bit of the technology and what's behind it. Because when you think about the requirements of automation, I think it's too broad to just say I need automation and orchestration, right? I want to help you get a little bit more, a couple levels deeper. And I actually use one of our products, screenshots in some of these so you can see the features in motion. But, certainly if you have other products you're used to, you can kind of equate, what I'm talking about to those. But I do think as you start to evaluate solutions and vendors, if you're in that stage, these are the things you ought to be thinking about when it comes to really putting together a successful IT resilience strategy leveraging automation. And the first one is boot order sequencing for end-tier applications. Right? And applications are rarely just one machine. And they're not always just one type of machine. You might have virtual machines in one hypervisor, virtual machines in another hypervisor, physical machines with Windows, physical machines with Linux, things like that. So you can even have cloud-based workloads involved here as well. So we know that applications are getting more complex. Typically, you do see, multiple machines kind of in the same environment, but we know that a lot of those applications can be backed by physical workhorse machines like databases and things like that. So it's important that any application, when you're talking about automating testing or even automating failover in a scenario where there is an outage, things need to come up in a certain order. They need to come up properly, and that involves knowing those machines, knowing the dependencies between them, setting the boot orders properly. Sometimes that can be automated. Sometimes you might manually do it. And not just doing it in ways where you have 1 through N, but understanding that some machines need something to be up and running first, but there could be many machines that rely on just that one. You don't want to have to wait from 1 to 10 for machines to boot. There are some that can boot concurrently after 1 or 2 machines are up and running. So you want to look for products that have kind of the flexibility and knowledge of being able to do concurrent recoveries at the same time within those boot orders, but also making sure that the sequence is right with the exact dependencies that you have. And that's why you can see in that screenshot that there are multiple machines in these boot orders, because it's not like there's just 1 through N from all the machines. Now, the next is application-specific integrity verification. So what do we mean by that? So obviously applications can be, there can be multiple applications kind of within a business service, right? You can have databases, so let's say you have SQL there. You could have application servers, you can have web servers. The list you see in that screenshot is not a complete list by any means, but there's a pick list within Unitrends in what we call recovery assurance to be able to do this application level verification and make sure that each component and each individual app creating that business service is able to verify not just that it can boot and not just that data is good, but that the application is truly recoverable and running so that the business service is up and running, because that's ultimately what matters. Right? It does not matter if a machine is up and running. It matters that the business service is up and running. And that's why it's so important not only that you get the dependencies right, but also that the applications themselves are working. Now, this next slide, a little bit different feel just because I had a different screenshot, but network automation is critical here. You could have multiple sites. You could be in the same site. It's important to understand the network topologies between those sites to be able to isolate things from production so that testing can occur, to be able to put things into a network where you can access it if you're doing some kind of on-demand lab as a part of this, or if you're doing true failover and you need users to be able to access it. Being able to set up those workflows around virtual network assignment, network remodeling, if it happens to be between an on-premise infrastructure and a cloud infrastructure or 2 different types of infrastructures, as well as re-IPing, when you just basically have different network IP schemes between the sites. So all that automation is really important to be able to point, click, and set up pretty easily as well. And then the last piece, right, we can't forget about the business. Understanding that all this is in place is great, having it automated is great, but in the end, it is certainly nice to be able to tell your boss, to tell the business stakeholders, the people that obviously care about your applications and business services being up and running. You want to be able to show them that it's going to work. And it can be really painful to do that manually, so automating that compliance reporting aspect at the business level is pretty important as well. So automation was a key part of IT resilience. What about ransomware? Right? We talked about ransomware earlier. We brought it up for a reason. And when we think about resilience, it goes beyond just automation of systems and recovery functions and things like that as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So if you look at kind of 5 ways that backup vendors fight ransomware, not all do it the same. And I think that you can see a little bit of this in some vendors, but in the middle, obviously most people, all backup vendors are doing protection, right? And that comes pretty standard. And of course, some do it better than others, and some do recovery better than others, but that's something you're going to see from all those vendors. So that's kind of why you see that in gray. But in the middle here around secure, test, and detect, there's a good bit of differentiation that you can look out for that'll help you evaluate vendors. I think the security piece is overlooked, and we'll talk about each one of these. The testing part we just talked about is often ignored. And when it comes to detection around ransomware, this is something that's pretty brand spanking new, and you're starting to see a little bit of this from some vendors, especially those that are really getting ahead of the game, ahead of the curve. So I'm not going to focus on protect or recover. I'll focus on those differentiators so that you can kind of work through that evaluation. The secure part of things. This is where you're seeing the overall architectural approach of certain vendors become a big differentiator. And what's really interesting is the incumbent vendors that have been around a long time, and even some newer vendors that are virtualization specific, that are also based on Windows and kind of have a traditional approach to being just kind of Windows-based backup software, they're in trouble a little bit, right? Because ransomware, when you think about it, is targeting Windows predominantly, right? And that makes sense because Windows is a huge market both in business and in the consumer worlds. And that's how it got to be $1 billion industry to begin with, right? Many folks that were hit by ransomware also had their backups impacted as well if their backup products were Windows-based backup software. Unitrends delivers, hardened Linux backup appliances, whether they're physical or virtual appliances. You can use either one. And I talk about Unitrends here because we've absolutely validated and seen this be a very real issue for incumbent solutions. We've replaced several solutions because customers were hit by ransomware. They had to rely on their backups. The backups were also hit, and they were unable to recover from the backups. And yes, it's good to have multiple strategies of making sure you have different copies of your data and off-site and all that, but in the end, you want secure backups because you know that those local backups are the ones that are going to be you're going to want to recover from first. That's going to help reduce your downtime as fast as possible. So I think it's just ultimately very important that you kind of acknowledge this shift. This was just validated by one vendor out there. I don't like to pick or use too many names in these webinars, but there is a blog on Veeam's website, which is a virtualization backup vendor in this space, that talked about this exact thing. Ransomware came in, corrupted Veeam's database, took over the backups, and obviously the production was impacted, and so were the backups. So I think this is something where the new approach, where you have a hardened lockdown Linux appliance that's purpose-built for backup and not generally purpose-built to be Windows software that's open. This allows not just the operating system difference, where you're not seeing Linux be targeted nearly as much from a security or ransomware perspective, but you're also talking about that hardening that I mentioned, where this is locked down just to expose what's necessary for the backup function. And that also makes it, much more less susceptible to any type of security or malware attack. We talked about testing. There are a lot of folks talking about automated backup verification. Just be wary about what's being done from the automation perspective. We talked about those automation requirements earlier as part of IT resilience. I think it's really important you look for solutions that have that full breadth of capability, because ultimately you can't necessarily trust automated tests if they're not going to that level of depth. So that's obviously a big part of the ransomware piece when it comes to IT resilience, is the testing we talked about. Now, detection is something that's pretty new. Ransomware detection. So this involves having adaptive and predictive analytics built into the engine of the backup system, analyzing that data as it comes in, searching for algorithms and other conditions that would expose a ransomware threat in the production environment, and then alerting its users and IT administrators proactively when those conditions are detected. This is a brand new feature, by the way, in Unitrends 9.2, and I think this is something that, from the perspective of what we did around launch, there were mentions in the Wall Street Journal. There were CSOs and CIOs going to bat around this, calling this game-changing technology. This is pretty interesting stuff. I think it's definitely new age, and it's just showing that evolution of solutions because of the evolution of problems. It does kind of mean that it's important to start thinking about the evolution of how those are discussed in marketing, and that's kind of why I think IT resilience, which Gardner started talking about, is a really good way of helping people understand that things can go beyond disaster recovery now, and even now into threat detection, to help people be resilient within IT and increase uptime, because that's ultimately what people want to do. So one shameless plug around Unitrends is when you look at a lot of the research that's out there showing a lot of these shifts that we've been talking about, these paradigms, from backup to disaster recovery as a service to IT resilience, Unitrends is actually the only solution recognized in all three of these pieces in the research that's out there. And I think that goes to show that, it does take certain vendors to be able to keep up and stay ahead of these solutions and these issues that are out there, and I think Unitrends has done a pretty good job. And ultimately, I think, what you're really looking to get to when you start thinking about having that coverage across backup, DR, IT resilience is you don't want to have to think about it too much. New threats are always going to come up. You can never not think about it at all when it comes to these particular things, but you really want to focus on your production environments, driving business value to your organizations. I don't talk to too many people that say, I want to play with backup all day. Back in my VM backup days, there was a lot of people that cared because they just love virtualization, and there might be a point solution around virtualization that they thought was really cool. And because they liked anything virtualization, it was fun for them. But I talk to those same people today, and those days seem to be gone because the critical workloads that have moved into virtual environments are keeping them so busy, they just need production to work better. So as a result, most people I talk with, they don't have time to think about backup. They want fewer vendors, more complete solutions that take less time to manage, and ultimately they trust will work. And IT resilience strategies play a big part in that. So just summarizing here, I think we'll be able to wrap up in maybe even less than 30 minutes. When we think about being IT resilient, you want to be able to start thinking about mitigating issues before they happen. That's done in a big part through automation. Automation around testing, automation around failover, automation around reporting. But that also requires that you understand different threats in the environment, and you can automate and be proactive around detection of those threats. And then, of course, you got to be able to fix them, which is what recovery does from backups. And by doing all the automated testing, you know that your backups are good. You know when your last recovery point was good. That obviously reduces the amount of time you're fumbling around with the recovery process. So I think that's a big summary. Hopefully that was helpful for folks. How you can learn more about all this with us, we have a very active blog. We do have our version 9.2 with ransomware detection available for download as a trial. I have one of our landing pages there. Just go to our website. It's easy to find. For a limited time, we like to give away free stuff. Obviously, somebody here will get $100 for joining the webinar. Anyone that downloads a trial will get a limited availability T-shirt that was actually designed by Stephen Bliss, who was the Grand Theft Auto graphic artist. So that part's kind of cool. But if you're here to just learn a little bit more about the product, you want to see more before you actually download and try it, we have live demos all the time. Some are ransomware themed, so you'll actually get to see a lot of this stuff very specifically in action. And we're always here to have a conversation if you ever want to talk with us. Kevin, do we have any questions?
Sure. Let's jump right in. But actually, before we get started, if you have a question, there's still time. You can type it into the bottom right-hand of your corner of your player, and we'll get to your questions as they come in. First question is, what clouds can Unitrends integrate with?
It's a good question. Unitrends has its own proprietary cloud called Unitrends Cloud. We run our software in there, we manage it, we operate it. We can do a lot of things to control that cloud. So that is a purpose-built solution all around disaster recovery and IT resilience, and we can handle a lot of the automation capabilities we talked about earlier today. We also integrate with AWS, naturally. We have a limited integration with Google just on the cloud storage side of things for offsite backups. And we do have integration with Azure as well. With AWS and Azure, we can actually integrate not only from an offsite compliance perspective and a DR perspective for failover and failback, but we can even protect workloads that are running in Amazon and Azure, including the ransomware detection piece that we were talking about.
Okay. The next question is, can I do all the automation and detection in my own DR site?
I'm sorry, Kevin. I was hopefully on mute when I coughed. But
you're about half on mute.
I didn't hear the question. Sorry about that.
All right, here we go. Can I do all the automation and detection in my own DR site?
Good question, because we talk a lot about cloud, and I think sometimes it gets a little nebulous here, but all the capabilities that we talked about with Unitrends, at least, you have at your disposal to run on-premise in your local site, in your secondary site, as well as in clouds.
Okay. The next question is, do you distinguish between production resiliency and disaster recovery?
I think that's a great question. I do. I personally do. I think it depends if I understand the question properly, so please follow up if I don't. But when I think about the automation and doing all that testing, I think there's a lot of value in being able to do that locally with your local backups and against that local production environment. So being resilient within your production environment, and sometimes these solutions can go way beyond Unitrends and backup vendors. You could be talking about solutions that are specific to the applications themselves so that they're highly resilient. I think it's excellent to be thinking, and this goes into the summary, right? You want to start mitigating these issues as much as possible and as frequently and as many places as possible, because we know that data and applications run in many places. So being able to do that in production, even before backup, I think is very smart. It's not always easy to prevent, right? So that's, we think about ransomware. Trying to prevent ransomware is something that has obviously been a very difficult task for security companies, and I'm not knocking security companies. They're doing a great job trying to keep up, but we're seeing the ransomware attacks be successful very often, and that's why backups are becoming a really important conversation for those security officers, because it's the next level of defense, and it's being used a lot as a defense. So I think disaster recovery is different in the sense that now you're talking about full site outages, resiliency against much bigger disasters. So great question. I think you definitely care about small disasters locally. I think you care about hardening your production environment as well. And you always want to make sure that, your big insurance policy around VR is available to you as well.
Okay. And I'm not sure if this changes the answer at all, but he added to that, does this mean he has to have multiple versions running?
No, I don't think so. Again, and happy to take this conversation offline with the user so he just gets all the answers that he's looking for here. But when we talk about multiple versions, we can do the automation leveraging the existing installations of our product, and we're obviously doing local backups in pretty much all environments, and then replicating backups to secondary sites for disaster recovery purposes. So you'd have multiple instances of our product handling those capabilities, which you really want that, right? Because having software in both locations allows for you to harden the network connection, get WAN acceleration and optimization so that we can handle the bandwidth and naturally handle any automation capabilities you would want at either site. So it doesn't require extra installations just to do the IT resilience piece. But in most deployments, you are going to see code on both sides of the network to make sure that, ultimately you have the most efficient solution possible.
Okay, next question is, I saw VMware in the screenshots. Is Hyper-V supported too for your automation?
Yes, so that was just a screenshot I grabbed from our demo lab that happened to be a VMware environment, but we can do automation within Hyper-V and VMware virtual environments, and that also goes for physical as well. We'll basically handle a capability that will automate the conversion from physical to virtual and do all of that IT resilience and automation and orchestration within either a Hyper-V or VMware virtual environment.
Okay, this question kind of goes to the IT managers needing to do kind of more with less. Do you have any opinion on why CIOs don't give backup adequate funds?
I don't have too much of an opinion as to why they don't. I wish they would. And to be quite honest, we're finding that we have a lot more conversations with CIOs and CSOs in our backup deals these days. And ransomware is a big instigator of that. It used to be that we would primarily be working with the IT teams, and because the conversation around backup has become more of a board-level conversation because of ransomware and these other security threats, it's getting a lot more play. So I certainly hope that as a result of some of the things you heard today, and if any of this helps you make a case because you're looking to get more budget for this because you understand the problem and you're having a hard time getting buy-in, hopefully a lot of this content will help. We'll be happy to send you more of it, and our website has a lot of it as well.
Okay, next question is the ransomware detection feature available today?
Yes, it is. So version 9.2 was launched last week, and this feature was a part of that.
And as a follow-on to that, how often are updates generally released?
It can vary because we've actually moved, I would never say, I wouldn't categorize what we're doing as continuous deployment by any means. But at the same time, we've become more fast cycle with putting in smaller features, and we typically will do kind of a 3 to 6 month cadence on bigger features. Believe it or not, from a code impact perspective, a lot of the analytics were already in prior releases, and it just took a little bit of additional calculation, alerting, and kind of fine-tuning to get the new feature out. But you should be able to get that update today.
Okay. And then one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. You talked about some names of magazines that discuss kind of new products and reviews. Could you mention those again?
Oh, sure. And would be happy to send a full list out. And I don't have the full list memorized because it was a significant amount. But in the Wall Street Journal, there was a great blog in their CIO Journal section that talked about ransomware detection. It had a pretty prominent CIO talking in that particular interview and referencing how, ransomware detection within kind of data protection solutions is kind of a game changer for those. But TechTarget picked it up. Let's see, who else? I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but there was pretty significant coverage. So again, we'd be happy to send a lot of the information out.
Sounds good. All right. Well, we're just about out of time here. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded, and you'll receive an email with a link to the on-demand version probably within a day or so. And we look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Take care, everybody.